This is the People Class Podcast, the official podcast of the People Class. Show your support at patreon.com/the People Class. Send us a shout out at the People Class on Twitter, and send us your feedback at thepeopleclass@gmail.com. Class is in session. In the context of our conversation today, the term centrist is also interchangeable with moderate. Please be sure to go back and check out part one of this conversation so that you can make yourself familiar with some of the terms that we will be using throughout this topic. And I'd also like to remind everyone that I have a terms database available on the People Class Patreon page. And these are just definitions that were, wrangled from Wikipedia. I consolidated them and did some light editing so that you can keep up. So right now, Brian, I want to present you with a Gallup poll I found in my research. I'm not sure if you or anyone listening considers Gallup or the architect of the poll, Nate Silver of 538, as a reputable resource. Sort of in my research here, there seems to be a tribal internet feud debating his legitimacy and clout as an authority figure, as a statistician overall. But in my research, I was able to gather that Nate Silver, more often than not, is praised as being one of the most reliable statisticians in the country. Okay, so Nate Silver tested Gallup's results overall and found that they are the least accurate resource for polling statistics among the 23 major national polling firms, showing an average 7.2 deviation. Now, if you remember back to Statistics 101, the goal is to be as close to zero as possible with a standard deviation in the data collected. It means a better quality and quantity of samples that translates into clearer patterns, so that preferably they form closer knit clusters visually. So a 7.2% or 7.2 deviation is not as trustworthy, but moving on. In this particular Gallup poll, it showed that between 35% and 38% of American voters self-identify as moderate over the past 20 years. That's almost half the U.S. population. This is what has brought us to the current state of our government.
I have a question on that poll. Do they define what moderate between what?
The poll looks at the average of how often Congress or the Senate has passed bills according to the current president's personal approval or disapproval of a given bill. If the president at the time was a Democrat that was pushing for social and economic equality or environmental protections, however, during a given presidential administration, how often did either side of the aisle support the president's agenda?
Sure. Okay. It's almost like the American people just want to be contrarian. Yeah, instead of just having a position and a value and not shifting towards a win based on who's popular, who's in office.
Correct.
The reason I was against Trump and Bush wasn't because they were Republicans, it's because of what they did. And The reason I was disappointed with Obama wasn't because he was a Democrat, because of what he did.
And didn't do, more importantly.
Yeah.
Circling back to my earlier point, in the 1980s, we see this fundamental shift to the right with the Democrats. They become the New Democrats, a new Democratic coalition, or Blue Dog Democrats, then align with more centrist left leaning, or even centrist right leaning conservative values. We're indoctrinated to believe that is what a Democrat is. I hope our listeners are starting to comprehend the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember I've heard this term before, but I remember when my best friend Evan, when he was alive, used it. He said I am socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. And when I
Fiscally conservative. It makes my ears perk up, people, and your shit as well.
right,
I'm going to give our listeners the definition of conservatism, which can be found on the terms database published on the People Class Podcast Patreon. All right, so according to Wikipedia, conservatism is a political and social philosophy promoting traditional social institutions in the context of culture and civilization. The central tenets of conservatism include tradition, organic society, hierarchy, authority, and property rights, most importantly. Conservatives seek to preserve a range of institutions such as religion, parliamentary government, and property rights with the aim of emphasizing social stability and continuity. The more traditional elements, conservatives are usually coined as reactionary because their policies are usually in reaction to populist demands at the time or other legislation that maybe the Democrats were successful at passing. So they oppose modernism and seek to return to the way things were.
can I stop you right there for
Go
a
ahead.
second?
No, go for it.
So let so let's think about what that means when someone says I'm fiscally conservative. Basically, we have this false delusion in this country believing that we can separate economics with social progress. These things are not separable. They are literally intangible. They're interrelated.
Correct.
So like we talk about the civil rights movement because like people of color, specifically black people in our case, had were economically disadvantaged. So part of that is why we got on the street and why we protested and why we marched for our civil rights. But in addition, we knew our civil rights would be trampled because we also didn't have any economic justice as well. Those things
Correct.
went hand in hand. So when someone says I want to maintain the status quo, the financial status quo of this country, you're also saying like I also want to keep inequality the way it is. I want certain people and folks of color to be on the bottom of the social economic ladder. I also want women to also be on the bottom of that ladder because that's the only way you can maintain the system as is.
This is key: sustaining, maintaining, making America great again, going back to the way things were. They don't want to change people, and at the expense of your human civil rights and your livelihood.
And here's another example of this. I have friends of mine who happen to be a gay couple, and they were looking for an apartment maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. And like one that this is again my own like privilege and bubble is that they were looking for an apartment to live in together because at first they were living separately,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't like go and see every available. Is this LA by the way, or at least Burbank, LA? Uh, they wouldn't go see these apartments together because they were afraid that if they talked to whoever was selling this apartment and they were introduced themselves, they wouldn't get the apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And like that level, I was like, I'd never even considered that. I'd never thought about like, oh, if I was moving in with my girlfriend, if I had a girlfriend, that I could we could look at an apartment together, suggest that we would both be living here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just like, and that's again the economic and a social framework working together. Like there's certain places, like if you're a gay couple that way, you couldn't live in certain places. You couldn't flex your economic muscle because of who you are socially. That applies to black people, Latinos. I was just gonna say like it doesn't matter uh the color of your skin or like the like people believe like it doesn't matter if your skin color if you're this or that. It's like as long as everything's green, and that's kind of the neoliberal idea of it because they just want to maintain already the hierarchies in place without thinking about how we can absolutely correct everything to make sure that people do have equality under the same system.
Wisdom, people. In my next Freedom University class session, I will be covering segregation in the U.S. labor struggle series, excuse me. And it's not the typical stuff you learn in school. That class session is available on all of our outlets, which are currently Patreon, YouTube, and SoundCloud. But I briefly cover the tipping system. African Americans in the U.S. since the abolishment of slavery, and I use that loosely, have been skirted into the outskirts of society and often forced to take on labor in which the employer had no obligation to pay the employee directly. My point being, economic equality is more often than not swept under the rug here in the U.S. It's never meaningfully addressed.
The reason why it's not addressed enough, because if we delve into the root of it, it comes down to, uh, uh, there's a point in this country where we don't want to address class, because class could actually help everybody or help more people.
Yet and still, ultimately, centrism is responsible for maintaining slavery in America. Nothing has fundamentally changed, and nothing will fundamentally change. Quote, 2020 Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden.
But what about all the slave owners, like financial earnings?
This is the cardinal sin of this Christian nation.
You don't want to hurt the slave owner's business.
Can't do that.
I mean, you can easily make the moral case on why, like, when you're liberating people from oppression, slavery, and here's the thing: the slave masters had a legitimate concern. They didn't want to lose their standing in society. They didn't want to lose their business, the only thing most of them had ever known their entire lives. Totally understandable, totally rational. Yeah, totally rational justification. But guess what? They were literally employing oppressed labor and oppressed people. So I'm sorry. These things just shouldn't be allowed to stand. And if any moral justification is just like, let's end slavery first and then worry about your financial obligations. I'm not saying not they shouldn't have been thrown out in the street, but it's like, hey, just stop oppressing people. Start there.
That is a great starting point. And for those of you listening today, remember, the meager wages or tips that newly freed slaves were fortunate enough to receive was only due to legislation mandating that labor must be compensated. This was not out of the goodness of the private business owners' hearts. Okay, that fact can't be ignored, and this occurred in the Confederate and the Union side.
Yeah, and it wasn't through civil asking them. Hey, maybe we'll just ask them to be good people and we'll be civil about it.
For more information on segregation and how the tipping system was established to keep blacks in America economically oppressed, please visit the People Class Patreon, YouTube, and SoundCloud channels. Check out my history of U.S. labor struggle series and as well as other quad sessions. All broadcasts from this sprawling campus of Freedom University. Freedom University. That's FU to the corrupt politicians out there. So moving forward with the topic of the failures of centrism in the U.S., I want to address the spy who locked the door to prosperity for the American working class. I've heard the right and left criticize Barack Obama for being the most liberal Democratic president to date.
They've also called him the most divisive. Specifically from the right, they call him that.
According to the data I'm about to present here, the mantle for most liberal Democratic president is actually awarded to our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. And I bring this up to make a point. Jimmy Carter is considered liberal, which is heading toward the extreme ideologies of socialism to a lesser degree, and communism, which is far left as you can go on the U.S. political and social economic spectrum. Jimmy Carter marks the furthest left position taken by any active Democratic president between 1945 and 2012, according to this study. So once again, we see a fundamental shift to the right in the new Democrat ideology that springs up in the 1980s.
Yeah, and probably every source of the word liberal too. Let's also talk about a little what Jimmy Carter was too, because a lot of people don't know much about him or his presidency. He was also deeply religious. He was also a peanut farmer, which he divested from that business to become the president. But also he kind of helped instill the initial implication that you can break up kind of like the rights of workers. There was something I think with the a truckers union that he clamped down hard on, and that kind of like broke them up a little bit.
But that was attributed to political pressures. Carter didn't have very strong convictions.
Right.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
so even within the context of like he's the most liberal, he's still all those things, like a religious guy who also went against a truckers union.
Yeah, that's why I maintain that Jimmy Carter is the marker for the pivot point for Democrats, essentially leaving an opening for them to manipulate civil legislation and industry regulation. And ultimately, we arrive to where we are in 2020.
Mm.
The proof is in the pudding. From income stagnation and increased productivity from the working class since his administration. But circling back to the spy who locked the door, Barack Obama, a 2012 Business Insider op-ed by columnist Rika Naik, and I hope I pronounced that right, presents us with a study showing that Obama is the most moderate president in U.S. history. Would you agree?
I can kind of get behind that. That that tracks to me.
Before we move forward with the data presented in this study, for any of you listening who fact check or catch any misinformation in these sessions, please let me know. Send an email to thepeopleclass@gmail.com with the subject amendments. Okay. I'm not perfect. There are things that I miss, and I'm human and make mistakes. So go ahead and correct me on that. All right, so we are now at the latter half of today's session. So to the People Class Podcast Twitter follower at Pussy Riot Girl, and to anyone listening today, please check back in on Patreon, YouTube, and SoundCloud for future sessions in the series. The failures of centrism. That this was a larger undertaking than we expected, and yeah, there's going to be more to this to come. And just to remind you once again that the failures of centrism is recorded from Freedom University, or FU, to the corrupt politicians out there. So moving on, political scientists Keith Poole and Chris Hare of the University of Georgia spearheaded a study that tracked presidential trends between 1945 and 2012. The data in this particular study was presented as a graph created by a multi-dimensional scaling application that analyzed preferential and choice data regarding legislative roll call behaviors. The data here is presented by colored points on the graph and maps where a given president placed them among the spectrum, ranging from the liberal left towards the bottom to the conservative right towards the top of the graph. The study includes Democratic presidents Truman, JFK, LBJ, Carter, Clinton, and Obama. And Republican presidents are represented by Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Herbert Walker Bush, and W. Bush. The Business Insider article explains, quote, each president's score was determined by looking at the presidential support votes by the Congress and Senate, end quote. So once again, the study is analyzing how often during roll call votes that the Congress or the Senate passed or rejected a bill based on the current president's support or disapproval of any given bill. The score is dependent on the number of times the acting president actually spoke out, for or against a given bill. And Keith and Poole state that this effect remains constant overall. There's a little deviation from this trend. The data presented here shows how the Republican presidents have moved further to the right than the Democratic presidents have migrated further to the left between 1945 and 2012. As a matter of fact, Looking at the graph, we can see both parties start their migration further to the right after Carter's administration. This is why I continue to shout from the bullhorn that the Democrats have essentially abandoned the left wing completely, and we are appealing to an empty wing.
I mean, part of this is just the American people's willingness to just. I saw a tweet this morning about like I think it was David Sirota saying like the Democratic Party is convincing us to just be comfortable with lying in a bed of shit, and that like if the Democrats, if the establishment Democratic Party specifically, if they shit the bed hard enough, will be just acceptable for lying in a little bit of shit because obviously the Republican Party will shit the bed harder. So if we don't actually stand up or organize and say, hey, these are the things we find acceptable, and one of those things is not lying in a bed of shit, then we can't expect our leaders, our representatives, to really not want to shit that bed constantly because it's all they've ever done. So giving folks like Obama and Clinton a pass for when they shit the bed is not helping our side at all. And I think there are enough people in this country and within the Democratic Party who say, who obviously the vote blue no matter who types, where they just are, I don't say comfortable. Here's the point. They want to operate more like the Republican Party, but not in the sense that they win and get what they want, as in more that they want us to be more authoritarian and just like shut up, don't question the dear leader, just get in line and vote blue because that's the only way we're going to get any of our redress. And I think there's a growing movement in the American body politics, and this probably comes mainly from a generational divide thing. Those of us who are younger who don't want to accept that. So we're not just going to support somebody simply because they're on our sports team.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, we want them to do stuff for us because, as I mentioned earlier, the Republican Party never shits on its base, but the Democratic Party constantly shits on its base. There's a phrase I heard a while ago. I don't think I've used on this program. Is that like that the politicians should fear the voter. You can definitely tell that like Mitch
Exactly.
McConnell, yeah, Mitch McConnell and all those people, they fear their base. Even Trump does to a degree. Even Trump fears his base a little bit. That's why he's always trying to curry their favor. He's Mr. Popular. He wants to be popular.
The Republicans give their base
Yeah,
concessions.
they do things for them, even if the things are hideous and draconian. Like when people say like Medicare for all is unrealistic, but then those same people also mention that the wall's unrealistic, and they're guess what? The wall is unrealistic, but guess what? Trump constantly says, "I'm gonna build the wall," and guess what? His people are cheering. They're cheering that wall being built. How
Mm.
ridiculous, unrealistic that wall is. But then we
In a
have
physical sense, yeah, because he has legislatively started building the wall, I think.
yeah. But let's break that down on just a moral and value proposition. One's talking about let's build a draconian wall to keep out the Browns on our southern border, and the other person's like, hey, let's provide health care for every single man, woman, and child. If both are unrealistic, you know what? I'm still going to choose the fact that I want everyone to have health care. That's just my value. I'll be the bad guy.
Ultimately, no party takes the initiative to improve the lives of average working class Americans.
They can't make those efforts if it conflicts with business interests, and that's again back to the socially liberal, fiscally conservative.
For those of you listening, please continue to check out Patreon, YouTube, and SoundCloud so you don't miss out on the conclusion of our conversation today. I would once again like to thank Twitter follower at Pussy Riot Girl for suggesting this quad topic. Before we conclude our session today, do you have any closing remarks?
No, that's pretty much all I need to say or want to say. I mean, I'll just briefly talk about like my general delusionment with the Democratic Party, but mainly my anger over centrism. This is something I've never gotten even during the Obama administration. Uh, if I remember, like I voted for Obama in 2008. I supported his
Same.
campaign, rallied for him, all that stuff. Uh, but I remember there's three moments where I was becoming disillusioned with Obama. I'll lead it to the final moment. So the first moment was during his speech after he won the presidency against John McCain, and he initially started with the like, I want to build the bridge to both sides, and I want to reach to over across the aisle to my opponent. And
Mm-hmm.
considering how even at that time that felt like a very divisive campaign, I was like, no, I don't. McCain's talking about like continuing the war on terror for another 20 years. Guess what? We're still in that war. But that's was one of the things McCain was talking about. It's like, I don't want to build a bridge to that. I don't want to build a bridge like insane conservatives like Sarah Palin and fucking hawkish mavericks like John McCain. I don't want to bridge those people. Fuck them.
Mm-hmm.
It's our time. We
That's the
they
same play Biden's making.
Yeah, and they had 8 years of Bush. We don't need another 4 years of that shit. So even at that time, I was a little concerned. I remember saying to myself, like, "Don't do that, Obama." After that was during the formation of his cabinet, and he put a bunch of Citibank people in charge. A couple of them were just in the Bush administration. I think Citibank and Goldman Sachs, specifically Goldman Sachs, and a
Yeah,
lot of them
yeah.
were just in the Bush administration. I can't remember their names off the
Mm-hmm.
top of my head. They're prominent. I just don't want to say the
Yeah, I remember Obama being involved with Citibank being my first red flag.
Yeah, and I remember that one. I was kind of like, "Ooh, what are you doing?" Because that's when I started thinking, like, is there like literally an Illuminati happening here? But
Right.
like,
Yo.
yeah, but even then, I was still willing to give that guy the benefit of the doubt. I was like, you know what? He probably knows better. He's going to be helming that ship. He's not going to let it get out of control. I hope he knows what he's doing. And that was my thinking at that moment. 2010, the tax breaks for the Bush administration for the wealthy was set to expire. All he had to do was absolutely nothing. He could have just let them expire. But because everyone was like, oh, he's playing three-dimensional chess, and he wanted to curry favor with the conservatives and the Republican Party, he reauthorized and signed the continuation of that book's tax breaks, which I think eventually lapsed in like his second term. But even still, there was no reason for him to do that. I forgot how much money he gave to the wealthy, but it was just like we were still hurting from the financial recession at that time. He had not done nothing for the foreclosure houses, and he was continuing the Bush wars on terror. I was 2010. I was furious, furious over just that one act because to me, if he had done nothing, we still could have gotten something from that, like our side, our position. It's like, okay, we're ending the failures of the previous administration by him simply inaction. Instead, he made the active choice to resign it, which means no, you're no longer just that's not foolishness, that's not naivete, that is complicity.
This is why I say the elite aren't indifferent to the working class Americans. They are actively hostile against us.
Right. And to me that was a sign of hostility. Because
Mm-hmm.
like he knew all he had to do was just nothing. And if the Republicans yelled at him, was like, why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you doing anything? It's like, that's not my bad. That's the Bush administration. I don't believe in that, so I'm not going to sign off on
Yeah.
that. Yeah, it's kind of like if there was like a policy, and I'll use race as an example because it's easy and fuck it. That if there was a policy that said if I took over like during the Jim Crow South,
Mm-hmm.
and literally there's a policy that's like if you sign this, we can continue segregation for another 2 years. But if you don't do anything, then segregation ends. And if I signed the policy, even if it was the curry favor with the right wing or conservative elements in there, I'd be complicit to segregation.
Exactly, by your actions.
Because like he could have come in there and just dismantled it entirely. Like that would have been ideally more moral than to kind of let it continue for 2 years. Like if I come in there and let segregation continue for 2 years, you can throw some shade at me. It's like, hey, why aren't you getting rid of this now? Lazy asshole, just get rid of it. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard, it's law. I gotta wait for it. There's all these legal presses. I'm just gonna let it expire 2 more years. I know I'll be held accountable for those 2 years, but you know what? Once it's gone, it's gone.
We had a legitimate opportunity to turn things around because what came out of the big bank bailouts were a worse job market, lower income, uh, security, and stability from the ensuing gig economy. Once again, this is why I draw my parallels with Herbert Hoover. The economy was bad. he didn't actively do anything to improve it and actually made things worse, which I think is a bigger problem than inaction.
No, he continued it. So I'm like, how can I justify that morally, ethically? They're like, oh, but there's financial issues, blah, blah, blah. It's like, nah. He did that for political reasons, and it hurt people, and it gave the wealthy more power and more control and more wealth, which was completely unnecessary. And guess what? Oh, under Obama's terms, the wealth gap only increased. It didn't decrease. I have to keep telling people that it was an increase under Obama. A proper left, or at least what should have been working class democratic framing, would have been that the gap between the rich and the poor should have decreased under the 8 years of Obama's, because it certainly increased under Bush as well. But Obama didn't turn that ship around. It was like, oh, it would have been hard for him. But like, at least if he did nothing, at least maintain the course, if that's what we believe he wanted to do, then it would not have increased. It would have been the same. And I can totally believe that he got in there and probably, because he's not a soothsayer, he doesn't have a crystal ball, he can predict the future. But like, you get in there and you start seeing the economy and the way American people are living, and you don't correct it. I'm like, now that's on you, bro. The first time you get, the first year or two you get in there, it's like, oh, I didn't foresee that, or at least the plans I made didn't quite work out the way I expected or intended. Then you start course correcting. But when he just doesn't do anything.
Thank you for tuning in to another session of the People Class Podcast, the official podcast of the People Class. I hope you found the information shared in today's session enlightening, or at the very least, raise some questions. I extend an invitation to join us for more weekly sessions. And remember, our work does not stop here. Get active, organize, and take control over your destiny as an American working class person. Class dismissed.